The liver is like the largest internal organ in your body, and this thing has a lot of jobs to do. So today we're going to talk about the 3 main functions of the liver. Okay, the big 3. There's a limit to how much alcohol the body can detoxify per hour. It's about 1/2 pound per hour. It's not exactly 1 pound per hour, but it's somewhere around 1/2 pound per hour. And if you have too much copper in the liver, you can develop this serious condition called Wilson's disease. Check it out. And people that have Wilson's disease end up having a lot of copper that builds up in the liver, but they also have a buildup of copper in other parts of the body, especially the brain. And this can affect the person's behavior. It can affect their personality. They can have tremors. They can have other neurological problems because you have too much copper. Now, normally, the liver will take that excess copper and it will bind it to something else to make it inactive. But if you have a genetic problem with this transporter that carries that copper out of the liver, then it can back up into the blood and you can have this copper that starts building up in other tissues. All right? So that means if you drink that much in a shorter amount of time than that, the liver is going to get backed up and you're going to start feeling drunk because the liver can't keep up with this byproduct that turns into acetate. So it backs up into the blood and it starts affecting your nervous system. So you might be thinking, okay, well, what about medications? Medications are chemicals. How does the liver deal with those? Well, a lot of medications have to be converted by the liver in order to become activated. One example is called a prodrug. It's a medication called Vantin. And so the liver turns this inactive medication into the active form of the medication. In other words, the inactive version of the medication, the liver activates it, makes it into its active form, and then that can go throughout the rest of the body and have its effect. Other medications, the liver will convert them into a more water-soluble substance so it can be excreted through the urine. So, for example, acetaminophen, that's in Tylenol. The liver converts that into a water-soluble substance and then you urinate it out. And the reason why that's important is because you don't want to keep this medication inside your body. So you have to make it more water-soluble so you can get rid of it. So no, 1, it produces bile to break down fats. It's going to package that cholesterol with some protein to make lipoproteins. These lipoproteins can transport that cholesterol to the rest of the body. If you don't have enough protein in the blood, then you're not going to be able to transport that cholesterol properly, and you can build up too much cholesterol inside the liver, which can lead to fatty liver. And I'm not talking about non-alcoholic fatty liver. I'm talking about alcoholic liver, which can turn into cirrhosis. That means scar tissue of the liver. And if you get enough scar tissue of the liver, you get to a point where you have very little functional liver left, and you could die from that. The liver produces something called heat shock proteins. These heat shock proteins help transport other proteins throughout the body. So if you don't have enough heat shock proteins, then other proteins aren't going to be able to fold properly, and they're not going to be able to function. Also, the liver produces these things called acute phase reactants. So during times of inflammation or infection or stress, the liver will produce certain proteins in response to that stress. Also, the liver produces your blood clotting factors. So anytime you have a cut or any type of trauma to the body that causes bleeding, the liver is going to send out these blood clotting factors to help stop that bleeding. Also, the liver produces albumin. Albumin is the main protein in your blood. In fact, if you ever have a blood test done and they say that your albumin is low, chances are there's something wrong with your liver. Now, sometimes you can have a kidney problem or some type of malnutrition, but usually if the kidneys are working and you're eating enough protein, then the problem is the liver. And so low albumin in your blood can cause edema in your legs. It can cause swelling in your ankles. It can also cause fluid retention because you don't have enough protein to hold the fluid. Also, the liver is going to produce insulin-like growth factor, which is IGF-1. So this IGF-1 works similar to testosterone. It helps build up your bones. It helps build up muscle. It helps increase your height, especially during puberty. And so, if a child doesn't have enough IGF, one, they're not going to grow as tall. And another hormone the liver makes is called thrombopoietin. Thrombopoietin helps stimulate the production of platelets. Platelets are these little cell fragments that help you clot your blood. And so, if you don't have enough platelets, you can have excessive bleeding. It's called thrombocytopenia. You could bruise very easily. If you accidentally bump into something, you might start bleeding profusely. But the liver produces thrombopoietin to help stimulate the production of more platelets. Alright, now that bile is stored in the gallbladder. So when you eat, the gallbladder squeezes out that bile into the small intestine to help break down fats. Now here's an interesting little side note. Bile salts are made by the liver. They actually become the bile salt when they get to the small intestine because there's something in the small intestine that helps convert the bile salts into bile. And then also another interesting thing is the liver produces this thing called bilirubin. Now bilirubin is like a breakdown product of red blood cells. So if you have a lot of red blood cell breakdown, you're going to have more bilirubin. This is why people with liver disease or even hepatitis or any type of liver inflammation or damage tend to have jaundice, which is this yellowing of the skin because the bilirubin is backing up into the blood and it is coloring the skin yellow. But the point is that the bile that comes from the liver into the small intestine, it's going to be very alkaline in nature. It's going to help break down those fats along with the help of an enzyme called lipase. Lipase is made by the pancreas, and so lipase breaks down the fats with the help of bile in the small intestine. Now remember, your small intestine has these little villi and microvilli. So when you think about bile breaking down fats, think of the size of the fat molecules. They're pretty big compared to the size of a little tiny villus or microvillus. So bile helps make those fats smaller so they can get absorbed. So the emulsified fats will be much easier to absorb. So bile salts surround the fats to form these little micelles, and they allow for better absorption of those fats. And then also another thing that's kind of cool about bile is that it helps absorb vitamin D. E and K. Now these are fat-soluble vitamins, which means they need fat to be absorbed. So if you didn't have enough bile or enough bile salts, you could potentially have a vitamin A, D, E, or K deficiency. Also, when you're digesting protein, especially animal protein, you can get this ammonia from the digestion of those proteins, which is toxic. And so the liver takes that ammonia and converts it into something called urea, which is less toxic, and then you can urinate that out as a waste product. Another cool thing about the liver is that it can detox certain chemicals like alcohol, but there's a limit to that. We'll talk about that in just a second. It can turn that alcohol into something called acetaldehyde, which is actually more toxic, and then turn that into acetate, which is less toxic. And so the liver is capable of getting rid of this alcohol by turning it into different byproducts, alright? But again, there's a limit to that. You can overload the liver. Another thing the liver does is it stores glycogen. So that's how you store excess glucose, right? Lines turn that into glycogen, and then the body can tap into that glycogen anytime it needs some energy. So the liver is like the storage spot for your energy. Alright? No. 2. It detoxifies chemicals. So we talked about alcohol, right? Now, number 3, the liver is a huge production facility for many things. So, for example, the liver produces cholesterol. And then lastly, the liver stores a lot of different minerals. It stores iron. It also stores copper. Now, since we're talking about the liver, if you haven't seen this video on milk thistle, I put that up right here.